Welcome back to the channel, guys. It's me, Paco. In the previous video we talked about shutter speed. In this video we're going to talk about aperture. Now remember, just like shutter speed, aperture, and ISO in a future video, regardless of what camera you're using, you could be using a phone, a compact camera, a DSLR, or mirrorless camera. Whatever camera you're using, the controls are more or less the same. Aperture refers to how wide or how narrow that opening in your lens is. So unlike shutter speed and ISO, which we'll talk about in the future, these are dependent on your camera. Aperture is dependent on your lens. If you have a removable detachable lens or interchangeable lens camera, it's always dictated by the lens. So it's measured in f-stops, and the lower the f-stop number, so if you have an aperture of f1.8, you have a wider opening. The higher the f-stop, the number, like 5.6, f8, f22, that makes it smaller and smaller. So what does that mean? And I'll show you here in a moment. Now, the lens that your camera comes with is usually a zoom lens. A kit lens is usually a zoom lens. And at its widest, when you zoom all the way out, the widest aperture you can get is 3.5. That's normally the case. And when you zoom all the way in, I'm doing that zooming motion here. I don't really have a zoom ring on this lens. But when you zoom in to the furthest you can go, that aperture widest you can go goes down to f5.6. It's a whole nother topic as to why that does that, but that's usually the case. Now, to give you an example of what that looks like, I've got my hand dandy camera here. Now, this is at f1.8, and f1.8 is that. That pretty much looks like that. That's how wide it goes. Now, if we were to go to something like, let's say, f3.5, which is the default that a kit lens would go to, that, there we go, so see that opening going down there, that is 3.5. If we go to something like f5.6, it gets smaller. And if we go all the way to what my lens can go to, f22, that's the smallest it can get. Aperture is how wide or how narrow that lens opening is. So it does two things to your photo. It controls the exposure. The wider the aperture, more light comes in to hit the sensor or the film. The narrower, less light comes in. At the same time, how wide and narrow that opening is, it controls your depth of field. So a wider aperture, like I said, will give you more light, and it'll also give you a shallower depth of field. So if your image is looking a bit dark, you can use a wider aperture, and it should brighten up your image until you get a proper exposure. But at the same time, you get a shallower depth of field, and what that means is that if you're focusing on my face, the background starts to get blurred out, and if you have anything hanging in the foreground, those elements in the foreground get blurred out as well, since what you're focusing is on my face. So wider aperture, you get a shallower depth of field. Background and whatever else is not what you're focusing on gets blurred. A narrower aperture would let less light in. So if your image is overexposed, there's too much light, it's too bright, you can use a larger f-stop number, making it a narrower aperture, and you'll get less light coming in. At the same time, you'll have a deeper depth of field, meaning you'd have more in focus, more of whatever you're taking a picture of, the scene that you're taking a picture of, or a subject. You'd have more of that in focus, so you get a less blurry background and foreground. Now, and I'm sticking to my script this time, why is that important? Well, if your image is overexposed, obviously you want to use a smaller aperture. Back, I had to open the door. We're moving, new apartment, awesome stuff. More of that in the future. So, as I was saying, why is this important? So if your image is overexposed, you'd want to use a smaller aperture, or larger f number, and that'll control the brightness. It'll make your image darker until you get a proper exposure. If your image is too dark, likewise, you can use a wider aperture, a lower f-stop number. You let more light in, and your image becomes brighter until it's properly exposed. Now, if our images don't look sharp enough, it could be because we're using a wide aperture, like if we're using f1.8, it's so wide that we have a shallow depth of field and we're missing focus. Now if a subject's moving back and forth and you lock focus and then they move in the last minute, since the depth of field is shallow and you take a picture, it looks like that it's blurred, but it might not actually be blurred. You might not have the eye in focus, but actually like the side somewhere around here. So the eye doesn't look as sharp as it should be. Thus, it looks like you're missing focus, or resulting in you missing focus. Now, when taking photos of a group of people, let's say you have 3 rows of people, if you're using a wide aperture and you're focusing on someone in the middle of those rows of people, only that person or that row of people will be in focus. So if you're using f1.8, the people in the front and the back would look blurry. Now that might be something you want to do, but if that's not what you want to do, if you want to get that group of pictures, if you want to get that group of people in focus, you want to use a higher f-stop number, a narrower aperture. And what that does, like I mentioned, it gives you a deeper depth of field. So if you focus on the person in the middle and use something like f5.6, f8, the people in the front row and the back row would be in focus. You have to remember that aperture along with shutter speed, which we previously discussed, and ISO, which we'll discuss in a future video, these all control the exposure and how bright or how dark the image is. In the next video, we'll talk about the last control, which is ISO, and there's a good reason for that. And hopefully you like how this video explains things and it helps you out, especially people out there, beginners. So if you like the tutorial, the explanations, please do drop a like and subscribe. You know, those things do help. And maybe we can put out more in-depth tutorials in the future, something beyond the basics. And yeah, see you around until next time.